This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Mari Crabtree, Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at Emerson College in the Marlborough Institute for Liberal Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies. She is the author of My Soul is a Witness, The Traumatic Afterlife of Lynching from 2022, and is currently working on 2 book-length projects, Co-opted, Essays on Black Studies and Ethical Practice in the Age of Neoliberalism, and Guile, The Pleasures and Political Utility of Subversion in the African American Cultural Tradition. In this conversation, we discuss how Black studies informs her conception of writing history, the place of politics and culture in the field, and how Black studies sensibilities shape thinking, pedagogy, and everyday practice. Good morning, Mari. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me here today.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really happy we found time to chat for a lot of reasons. I really love your work. I just want to link to it in the written part that comes along with the podcast. But I absolutely love your book. It's one of the most interesting and I think really important books I've read in a long time. And so having a chance to hear how you think about Black studies, knowing your work then and knowing the kinds of things you're working on now, I just think it's a really important perspective, really important voice to have on the podcast. And I will also say, because you're someone who as an undergraduate worked in Black studies, but also, and we'll have a chance to talk about this, also have worked in Black studies as a professor, that gives you these really deep roots in the field. So your perspective is really going to add a lot to the series. And so that's a long way of saying welcome and really thank you for making the time.
No, thank you so much for having me again. And I've been following the podcast, and I do think that this is an important series of conversations to be having at this point. We were talking earlier about inflection points and all the inflection points that we're in right now. And I think that the 50th anniversary is important, but also we're just seeing the world change in ways that have implications for Black studies.
Yeah, I mean, Ashley and I have talked about this series either being an archive of Black studies before it's eliminated or Black studies in a time of crisis, deep crisis. As you said, inflection points, there's a long list. But thinking about this series and getting these reflections, even in a time of crisis, I think is so important because it's a way of talking about the diversity, complexity, and depth of the field. So great to have you here. And, we'll have a chance to talk about your work and how you think about the field, the Black studies, how you think about classrooms and research in the field. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question, which is ask you to talk a little bit about what drew you to the study of Black life, whether it's sort of from childhood through college, graduate school, and so on, and what drew you to Black studies, but also what sustained you in relation to this kind of work.
So my introduction to real Black studies was in college when I was a first-year student. During orientation, they had a panel with some professors and students. And there was this professor, Jeffrey Ferguson, who was speaking on this panel and was so smart, so interesting. And one student in the audience asked him, Professor Ferguson, what do you teach? And he had mentioned that he taught Introduction to Black Studies, which he was going to be teaching in the spring. So that's the reason why I took Introduction to Black Studies with him. And very soon after that, declared a major in Black Studies, because the conversations that we had in that class felt so relevant and necessary. And they had been absent in so many ways in the way I'd been educated up until that point. One of the first things that we read in that class was a book by Nathan Huggins called Black Odyssey. And Nathan Huggins had been Jeff's undergraduate advisor and professor. And in the introduction to the most recent edition of the book, I think it's from 1989 or 1990, he talked about what he called the deforming mirror of truth and the master narrative of American history. And he introduced these concepts that made it clear to me, like, what's at stake when you have an incomplete understanding of American history that doesn't place slavery and the Black experience in all of its iterations at the center of it.
Hmm.
And that kind of perspective um, really just completely shifted how I thought about all of the history that I'd been taught, but also the kinds of narratives that I had, sometimes unquestionably, sometimes like with lots of skepticism, but and I had encountered that up to that point, and it was in that class that I first read James Baldwin's work. It was in that class that I first read. Works by a wide range of works by African and Caribbean thinkers, and it just really opened up my eyes to a different way of asking questions and a different mode of inquiry that felt really necessary. Um, and so it was through that undergraduate experience that I had this really lovely introduction to Black studies, and it has always been my intellectual home. Like when I got my PhD, I was in the history department, but my intellectual home remained Black studies. I was kind of doing Black studies, but in a history department. And even with the particular people that I had on my committee, and even the kinds of things that I was thinking about and reading and writing about in the history department were much more inflected with a kind of Black studies perspective than I think a lot of my other peers who were in the history department. And since then, I've really had I've used many of the texts and questions and conversations that were, again, rooted in that undergraduate experience, and they've carried throughout in various unexpected ways into the rest of my career. I teach a class on James Baldwin in large part because of having read James Baldwin closely multiple times in Black Studies classes at Amherst College. I also am very curious about historical memory because David Blight was one of my undergraduate professors who I worked with closely, in addition to Jeff Ferguson for my honors thesis in college. And I've even found that the Caribbean poetry that I was reading with Professor Rhonda Kamasander has found ways of inflecting how I also think, even if it's not in what I'm actually directly studying. But I was recently thinking back to the course that I took with her, and I wrote this paper about the sea as history and Derek Walcott's Omeros. And it made sense because as somebody who was thinking about historical imagination and W.E.B. Du Bois in that moment, there was this kind of resonance between these very different authors, right? Walcott and Du Bois. And so there's many things from that period that have continued to shape how I think. And I think that Jeff's work on resistance and the kind of limits of the resistance paradigm, his work on escape as a concept, his work on the blues have also definitely had an impact on the kinds of questions I ask, the kinds of texts that I read, and the ways in which I approach just thinking in more generally.
So obviously, just to state the obvious, I'm so pleased for Jeff's name to come up. Rest in peace, Jeff. We really miss you. And it's funny you say, that you mentioned Huggins' Black Odyssey. I mean, that's, my first I think 6 years of teaching in Black Studies. We're sharing an office with Jeff, and he used to push that thing. I was like, you would have made a great drug dealer." He's like nonstop. But I remember reading it. And I was like, this is why it's the centerpiece of his intro course, right? What sticks out for me is the epilogue around Sic Semper Tyrannis, right? This has always been a tyranny, and I beat my students over the head with that. So I love that we, in a different way as a colleague for me, but as a student for you, carry on that sort of part of the Jeff Ferguson bookshelf. But also that's every educator's dream, right? That even an introductory course, sticks with somebody who goes on to educate people. So that's a wonderful way of tying it together. And also just as a sensitive touch place, like the Sea is History was so transformative for me as a thinker and writer too. So this is a wonderful constellation. And just the last thing about Jeff for me, but I imagine him on that panel. I mean, it had a particular kind of charisma, but a charisma that I think is the charisma of Black Studies, which is the way we are going to engage this is not with a series of propositions. It's with this entire immersion in, Sea is History and in a sort of imaginative fantasy of the archaeology of Black life in the Atlantic world, or, the terms of writing history, the terms of understanding America and all of this. So I love that. I mean, when you have that richness of Black Studies at the origin of your own education in the field, you kind of have a hard time narrowing and going back, I imagine.
Yeah, yeah, and it also really did get me to ask really different kinds of questions,
Mm,
and you see this in my book, for example. Like, it started as a dissertation in the history department, but it finished off as a book in an African American studies program.
yeah.
And so the transformation in the kinds of questions that I was able to answer in making it into the book, is a reflection of that, kind of going back to those intellectual roots, which has always felt the most comfortable for me.
Mhm. Well, this is a perfect sort of stage then for my next question, which is to ask you about your portrait of Black Studies. How do you imagine the field? How do you understand the field? And I want to ask this in the context of its founding, which had a tension built into it, right? There was a demand by students, maybe some faculty, but really by students, that there be a place to study the Black intellectual tradition, that was not represented in departments. And so Black Studies was going to be that place where explorations of the intellect and the imagination, literature, art, history, and so forth would take place. But sort of at the same time, it was, this was a moment, 1969, 1970, when there was a radicalization in Black liberation struggle that had really burst any sense of boundary between study and prescriptive politics, between campus life and community transformation and political struggle. So there's also at the founding of Black Studies that imperative to have prescriptive politics, not just a descriptive account of Black life. And so I think although, it's 50-something years since, I do think that we still wrestle with that in the field of Black Studies, like how to think about the field in relation to these two magnets, these two poles that are really deep moral and political obligations. And so I'm interested sort of in that ask it in that context, but really just to ask you the question, how do you think about the field? What's the portrait you work with?
So on the one hand, I do think that there can be a tension between a kind of desire to create a proscriptive political roadmap, um, and on the other hand, kind of wonder and intellectual study. But I often find them converging for me in my work. I think the wonder is absolutely important for any kind of intellectual work. I think one of the things I have loved about being in Black Studies is because you're not as constrained by disciplines and methods, there is a kind of flexibility to be imaginative, to allow yourself to think beyond whatever like a historian or a sociologist or philosopher would say are like the way that you do this.
Mhm.
And so I found that Black Studies has always allowed me to kind of indulge in that wonder, to embrace that imagination, to make my work better. And also but ultimately the aim of the work for me, has always been thinking about the deeper significance on actual people, on an actual society, of what it is that I'm working on. Um, and so it's hard for me to disentangle the two personally, because I've always seen the two actually working quite a bit in tandem with one another. Um, and so that's for me. I mean, there hasn't been that same kind of tension. Now I do get that there are some calls, for example, to have courses that talk about kind of Black accounting, so that you can have, some sort of like tangible skill set for dealing with the economic realities of financial life after college or something like that. And that's not really what I think of as part of Black studies. But I do understand the impulse to go there.
Mhm.
But I do think of that as actually often a kind of separate. But I think the sense of like the political import of knowing a set of ideas about what it means to be free, what liberation struggles look like, those are all, for me, tied to these other questions that are an extension of a kind of sense of wonder and imagination. So maybe I do have some limits on what I think should be within Black study, but I also think that the two for me have not felt like they have been fighting against one another. It doesn't always manifest the same way, right? There are some, you know, areas of inquiry or paths of inquiry that someone might take that might be less clearly paving a pathway to, some sort of particular, social change or something like that. But I do think that um, I've always felt that the two have actually worked quite a bit in concert with one another.
I mean, I've said this before on the podcast in this part of the conversation. I do think there's something interesting to me about even asking this question in 2025, where there there is clearly for the far right and a white nationalist fascist government a desire to eliminate this kind of study. And so the question is it just sort of objection to ideas, or is it this sense that those ideas already have such political significance that they become intolerable under a certain regime? And so I've kind of wondered myself sometimes if this question isn't, and this distinction isn't embedded in a kind of moment where we felt like sort of Black intellectual life was flourishing and therefore could seem kind of detached from political movements, which were about mobilization in the streets around economic justice or against police brutality. But we've really arrived at that moment where it's like study and activism seem to be difficult to distinguish, certainly in terms of persecution.
Mm-hmm.
But also, in this podcast and talking with curators and activists, which is a small part of the podcast, it'll grow as part of it. But there's always the role of study. People value study immensely.
Yeah.
Because as you said, this sense of the imagination of what life is, what flourishing is, what political righteousness is. Actually, we want that for the directness of our actions.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of many things that I love about Robin D.G. Kelley's book, Freedom Dreams. He says very explicitly in the beginning, that this idea that you're either in the streets or you're studying is just not how it should work. You actually need to know things. You need to have thought about and imagined what freedom would look like and why to do the work on the streets and on the ground, right? So I do think that the two work very much in tandem with one another. It just depends on, there's gradations.
Yeah. And as teachers, you never know what sticks with the student when they walk out. We've all had that thing 10, 15 years later. They talk about some conversation that actually changed the way they see things. I love those because 9 times out of 10, I have no idea what they're talking about. But that's why, that's the magic of education is it's unpredictability, but that engagement with the imagination. I mean, it's potency across ranges of life that are so important to Black liberation struggle. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, let me ask you about your work. Your work is has deep cultural sensibilities. As you said, your PhD's in history, very historically oriented in many ways. You do critical work in memory and representation in your book. And there's just so much insight that comes from that combination of approaches. And I think in that way, Black studies really activates so much of all of those different approaches, which are their own fields. But it's a really potent mix. And I'm interested in reflecting on your own research and your own orientation, how you think that fits in the history of Black studies. Sort of how is it a part of the tradition, but also how does it push new boundaries, open up new horizons in the field?
So I think that any good scholar, but I think maybe in particular any good Black Studies scholar, should pay homage to the kind of important thinkers in their field in some ways, and that certainly has been the case in terms of how I understand what I do. It's always refracted through Du Bois or Toni Morrison or Imani Perry or James Baldwin or Kevin Quashie. Like I'm always kind of trying in some way, in conversation with what other scholars, whether they're from a long time ago or even my contemporaries, have been working on, but also artists and other kinds of creative, thinkers. And so I think that in a way, I couldn't have imagined my book without having read James Baldwin, who writes about, in a short story, about memory and lynching in the South during the 1960s. I couldn't have written about the haunting that I write about in that book without thinking about and with Toni Morrison and what she says in Beloved about places holding on to the memories of people who had been there before and experienced some kind of trauma. I couldn't have really done the work on a kind of Black interiority without thinking with Kevin Quashie and what he says about quiet. And like the blues artists that I listened to while working on the book and the research, that kind of sensibility of the blues being a part of like how I do what I do. So I've always tried to be good to the people who have inspired my work, who I'm in conversation with, and who give me like a foundation upon which to explore new ideas, or to take a particular set of ideas in a different direction. Certainly, Jeff Ferguson is one of those as well. I've been thinking with him a lot more recently, as I've been thinking about subversion and guile as a mode of, I guess, dealing with the ways of the world that pushes back against the world in ways that are more complicated than mere resistance, because they're also there's a sense of ingenuity and pleasure, and sometimes even like cackling and laughter embedded in that as well. So I've been in many ways my next monograph is coming out of kind of thinking alongside several other scholars, like Jeff, like Kevin Quashie, like Imani Perry, who are thinking beyond kind of resistance. And I also want to give a shout out to my friend, Evan Neighbor, who's a visual artist. And he reminded me many years ago in his living room about the importance of the sublime as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that being one very important way to kind of combat the tendency to kind of think about Black life through resistance and through suffering, because it kind of takes it out of the equation in certain ways without forgetting about the realities of the world. So I think that there's I've always kind of drawn on what other people have done, um, and tried to use that as a way to think through new ideas, and new kinds of questions.
It's interesting hearing you talk about this because, you know, as you were saying, it's what you're working on and sort of conceptual formations that you're interested in establishing and exploring are so rooted in canonical texts of the African American tradition, but the concepts at the same time don't have steady names. I mean, you yourself were like, it's like, still looking for that conceptual language that can capture and expand and however we want to think about it, these things that have been witnessed and evoked for a
Mhm.
century or more. So I love that as a way of thinking about the relationship to the past and being embedded, but also pushing new horizons. Because it's a I don't know if you said homage, but that way of like having our paying our respects to the tradition is that way of saying the tradition has already said this, but here's a way of saying it that opens
Mhm.
up something new. I love that. So all that's just like doing a cliff notes on what you said because I really love that. I love that as a vision of engagement with the tradition because it also places at the center of that engagement a sense of deep respect.
Mhm.
So, you know, going back to your education a little bit, you've said, your undergraduate education was in Black studies very deeply. Your PhD was in a history department, but really, that then your book becomes an African American studies book. And I'm interested in hearing you reflect a little bit on how this movement between multidisciplinary or area studies, however we want to talk about it, movement from Black studies into a discipline and then back out of a discipline and into Black studies. How that movement, in and out of a disciplinary work has impacted how you understand research and research writing, but also how you construct a classroom.
Yeah, I think my interlude in history when I was a PhD student uh, was really formative in a lot of ways. It was the first time that I had a kind of methodological, um, disciplinary kind of set of rules set up for me, in ways that actually pushed me to think, about what I could say, as a scholar. I It's not as though I abandoned that with the moment that I, got got out of the history
Sure,
department,
sure, sure.
but it definitely gave me, a sense of, like, some of the constraints that comes with disciplines, but I also find myself every once in a while thinking, "Oh my god, that you're asking a history question, like, you're doing this, like, so I know it's
Mhm,
there, it's, like, definitely,
mhm.
like, a core part of how I think, at this point, and actually my current job is the first time that I've taught straight up history classes.
Oh,
I
wow.
only teach 1, but, and I'm given a lot of flexibility in how I teach it, but the history course itself, was actually kind of novel and fun to teach something, that I had not had an opportunity to teach, before because there were actual professors in the history department who were teaching them, at my previous institution. Um, I think that shift back and forth, though, has given me a really, wide range of intellectual experiences. And it has also helped me hone the reasons why I like doing, Black studies in
Hmm,
particular.
mhm.
I think that the book, for example, was there was a chapter that wasn't part of the dissertation that was in the book, and there were a couple chapters that got really fleshed out in the book that did not. They were a little anemic in the dissertation.
Yeah, yeah.
And the different I can tell the difference, in reading those chapters, like, which are the ones that, were written when I was more deeply embedded in an interdisciplinary Black studies space, which were the ones where I was asking a slightly different question. I think that a lot of historians, for good reason, it's a good question to ask, is they ask, like, about change over time. They ask about what is the point where this change happens. They talk about continuities and how the continuities are not maybe, exact replicas of things that happened before. And I found myself at the final stages of editing putting a little bit of that in there
Hmm.
because I think it would help historians find the book a little bit more legible to some of the things that they were interested in. But it wasn't in there as much in the kind of first couple of sets of revisions of the book manuscript. So I do think that it's definitely helped me ask different kinds of questions. It's allowed me to lean into a kind of imaginative space, which,
Mhm.
to be honest, again, maybe this is the Walcott part, like, talking, but I think history is actually an imaginative space. It's just that people aren't always allowed to, um, take it to its full imaginative potential because they are worried about being told that they are, making stuff up or it's not, based in, some kind of hardcore evidence and, um I do think that there is some one of the things I like about having this combination of Black studies and history is that it allows me to kind of push some of the things within history that are a little rigid that I think actually make it better, could make the study of history better. Um, but it also does make me ask questions in a Black studies context that are historically oriented and also are, I think, an interesting and important thing to think about.
I mean, history has such a such an important part. It plays such an important role in the history of Black studies, right?
Mhm.
And as a sort of maybe the foundation stone, along with literature, of the field. But what that means to say history in a Black studies context is always so interesting to me. So I was really excited to hear what you had to say, which was really, really interesting because, history, there's that part of history that is almost can think of itself as a social science.
Yeah.
So when you said hardcore evidence, that sense of of documentation and empiricism and kind of positivism. But then there's also the demands that so much history in a Black Atlantic context requires, which is that you think in between evidence, because what is evidence? It might be a ledger, right? And how do you think the lives in that, right?
Yeah.
And but the Black studies liberating that I really love. But also I appreciate how you were also saying, and I think this doesn't always come out in this part of the podcast, where people who are trained in disciplines will say, that sort of liberated me from the constraints. But I like the way you came back to what history actually also gives to that Black studies sensibility, that there's a dynamic there where actually disciplines have something very important to say to Black studies
Mhm.
in a relation that's a relation of exchange rather than imperialism around, what is real evidence, what is a real argument.
Mhm.
And did you find that in your doctoral training, I mean, was that a contested space for you as a student, or did you feel like you actually landed in a place where people created a sort of a margin or maybe even a centerpiece of historical study that would allow Black study sensibilities in?
So I was very lucky with my graduate committee in that they gave me a lot of leeway in terms of exploring ideas and questions and methods. Um, I also had the poet Ken McLean on my committee, so everyone kinda knew I was interested in, some of the literary, works, but also because he was a poet, not a scholar of poetry, there was a kind of attention to language and an attention to narrativity that was actually incredibly helpful in the development of the dissertation as a study of how Black Southerners told the stories of, lived through and beyond the trauma of lynching. So, I did have and even with the three historians who are on my committee, one was in industrial and labor relations and American studies, the other one was in Africana studies, and the third one was in history. And so there was already a kind of mix of um, disciplines in not even necessarily in what the historians were doing in their own work, but with the people who they were talking to all the time, their
Mhm.
colleagues. And so I think that there was that kind of openness. Sometimes I felt, and I say this with deep love and as a positive, but I felt a little feral as a grad student because I was really let kind of go do whatever you need to do. Read what you want to read. And they reined me in once in a while with like, okay, here's some suggestions for this, that, and the other. But I really was allowed to explore, and that was one of the reasons why I chose Cornell was because unlike some grad programs that are quite rigid in terms of what specific courses you have to take to be a history PhD, it was much more open. I had a lot of directed readings, a lot of like creating my own reading lists with a professor or just reading with a professor. And week by week, depending on how the conversation went, we might change what we were reading. And so there was a kind of fluidity to that was also responsive to what I was interested in, without making it so that I was not going to. I definitely had a good like foundation in core texts and things like that, I did have that kind of freedom, and that was really refreshing and I think important. And I don't know how well I would have done with a very heavy-handed, um, directed, um, style of mentoring or graduate, study. It was very nice to be given or really to be trusted,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
have the intuition to know that a particular series of questions or ideas were worthy of study and that, I could figure out a way to explore those ideas.
So I'm going to have to now, I'll footnote you when I can, start describing my own graduate work as feral because because I've always struggled with the word because I really liked being neglected.
Mhm.
But it was neglect that wasn't sort of they didn't care. I mean, they care deeply, right?
Mhm.
And they definitely like, same as you said. I mean, they're still keeping me on the rails and everything, but they're also like, you're going to determine how fast you go here, what direction you go here. And I loved being feral,
Mhm.
but until they bestow the PhD on you, it's hard to trust. It's like, especially I grown up, in college with this idea that, when you go to grad school, your mentors tell you what to do, a kind of really hyperbolic thing. But I
Mhm.
like feral. That's much better, especially given the amount of alcohol and barbecue you consume when you go to grad school in Memphis. So I like the feral. That's the way of talking about it. And I think that's a great way of honoring your committee to say they let you be feral.
Mhm.
Um, well, let me ask this as a sort of big speculative question about the past 5+ decades in Black studies. What do you think that Black studies has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
So I think that one of the most obvious things that Black Studies has done well is that it has embraced and supported the work of Black scholars whose work had not previously been given a place in academic study and had not been given, the kind of, legitimacy that it deserved and the kind of seriousness of considering it that I think it deserved. I also think that, very few of my students come to my classes thinking that African American studies is somehow or African American history is somehow, like, peripheral, and I think that
Mhm.
there has been, um, in some ways that has trickled out into the kind of popular imagination that you can't talk about the US without talking about Black people, that you can't talk about its history, its culture, its politics, its economics without talking about Black people. And I really think that Black studies is one of the reasons why that is the case. Even if it doesn't always manifest in all the ways that you want it to, like maybe it just means that they've read, their eyes were watching God. But maybe it also means, other things. Not that there's any problem with Hurston. I love Hurston. I also think that especially early on, the field was very much attuned to the really damaging stereotypes about Blackness, the caricatures of Blackness, and has done a good job of complicating and combating the imagination about Blackness. Sometimes to a fault, it's been almost, it can also kind of lean into kind of respectable place sometimes, but I do think that given what the 1960s or the 1950s were like, it was a really important corrective. And I think we're in a place now where we can very much complicate and move beyond just the combating of the stereotype. But I do think that was important work that was done in that, especially the 1960s and 70s. You look at the studies on slavery that talk about Black community, like that was just not a thing that people talked about, that go beyond this kind of white paternalism, that talk about Black resistance. Like these were all really, really important ways of talking about Blackness that just had not been in the mainstream. So I think Black studies, especially in that particular example, the study of African American history, has been really instrumental in changing these horrible stereotypes that were so common. And they still crop up. They definitely still do. But I think that it was really important for changing that.
Yeah.
Some of the things I think that Black studies has maybe not done as well, although I do think that some of this was talked about early on, but what do you do when you are a field that is built on protest, that is incorporated now into these massive institutions, and then the kind of neoliberal turn in the university is a slightly more recent phenomenon, so I don't fault anyone for not necessarily anticipating that turn. But I think that finding ways to think about what it means to be a part of a university or college, to be part of academia, and not be co-opted, not be exploited, not have the very worst parts of neoliberalism extract from Black people, Black communities, Black culture. I think that's one of the things that I think we're currently really should be talking about and thinking about. I also think that there's, in some ways, I was thinking about this the other day because I was back at Amherst and thinking about the UMass Amherst Black Studies department, which in so many ways, the faculty in that original department are unimaginable as faculty right now because of the ways in which credentials have become so important. Having a PhD has become so important for teaching in Black studies. And I think that there is a way in which the string from that original very dynamic, very interesting, community-oriented, activist-oriented, kind of artist-oriented professor has had some negative impacts on the field over time. Again, it's a part of that kind of incorporation into these institutions, which has come with the sort of credential expectations that I'm kind of a little worried about.
No, I that you're the first person to bring up this question of credential in the podcast, at least that I can think of, and I think that's so important. I remember a very early podcast with Elena Guzman at Indiana, who's a filmmaker but also an anthropologist, also a Cornell PhD. Um, and she was talking about, how do you get a film to count as your tenure, part of your tenure and promotion case. And one of the things that conversation evolved into is just that the founders of the field were so deeply connected to artists, to musicians, to poets, and the idea that we now arrive at a place where, like, Charles Burnett couldn't be hired,
Yep.
Sonia Sanchez couldn't be hired. I mean, what does this mean? I think that's a moment to look in the mirror, and you've really put it really sharply there, and it is about the neoliberal university, about credentialing and all of that. And it's also about how, I think you're right. It's something that we haven't really thought about as a field in a very deep and rigorous way, but it's both at our doorstep and in our past, as you put
Mhm.
it, as you outlined there. And so I love that. Thank you. This lots of things that are great in this podcast. That is something I think everybody needs to think about. I'm really happy that you put it that way. Thank you. And so, I mean, maybe that's already then an answer to this last question I have for you. But in a Black Studies context, what is the question you would want us all to be asking? What is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
I have a few that I've been thinking through. I'm working on a book of essays on ethical praxis in Black studies, and I think that is an important question to continue talking about. Um, I think Joshua Myers in his book and Stefan Harney and Fred Moten in their book on the Other Commons have talked a bit about what it means to, like, do Black studies ethically. But I think that's one of those questions that I really want to talk about more. And part of this is coming from this. This, if we go back to the 50s and 60s, where so much of Black life had been understudied, and so much had a thin evidentiary base. Although a lot of it doesn't, right? But at that point, it's really important to uncover stories. It's really
Hmm.
important to, as I think people often say, like, find untold stories or unheard voices. And I think I don't disagree with that impulse, right? I don't want erasure. I don't want silencing. But I also want to think about, in the ethical realm, like cultural privacy.
Hmm.
I want to think about, especially in this neoliberal space that we're occupying, um, is the urge to find every untold story animated by production for the sake of a university to be able to say, oh, you wrote this thing?
Hmm.
Or is it because it actually serves some greater good? And it can't simply, for me, be like, well, we just know now, we didn't know before. Like, I think there has to be something more thoughtful about what rationale we use for telling some stories. And there's certain parts of the Black experience that, as someone who is not Black, I find there should be questions in particular should be asking about what is none of my business,
Yeah.
and what do I not have a basis for really talking about this thing or analyzing this thing or understanding a particular topic. And so I think that some of these ethical questions have to um, be thought about, especially because, although I understand why initially there was this push to focus on what hasn't been told, what hasn't been found, you know, we need to know why it's important that we uncover things. And so that's one of the things that I've been thinking about. I've also been thinking a lot about questions around, like, culture and authenticity and essentialism. In January, I taught Stuart Hall's "What is This Black and Black Popular Culture" with a group of my students, and I think that that kind of enduring question about what makes Black popular culture Black, without falling into a kind of essentialism, um, continues to be relevant. And I know Paul Taylor's written about this a little more recently, but I think that with the way in which Black culture is being consumed globally, the ways in which you're seeing, I think, even more kind of fracturing or splintering within the Black community and Black culture, that some of these questions, I think, really should, like, I think it'd be useful to actually come back to them
Hmm.
and think about what does Black culture mean in the particular times in which we live, where there's this fracturing, where everything is super accessible, where cultural privacy is basically gone.
Mhm.
How do we think about what makes it Black?
This is a fantastic place to end, because those are two really, really, um, I mean, they're not just interesting questions, but they're really at the heart of Black studies as a political project and an imaginative project, but it is also an ethical project and really opening up in the way that you just described this question. I love that. No pressure, but you got to come out with this collection. This is going to be really, really important stuff. And always, and all those of us who teach and ask the question, what do you mean by Black in this, to a group of students or even any kind of a group, that's a tough question. So what is the Black and Black studies?
Mhm.
I mean, just to end part of where you began with Jeff Ferguson, I remember him saying one time somebody was asked him in our office, what is Black studies? And he goes, you study Black people. And they were like, well, okay. And he was like, but the problem is, what is the Black and Black people?
Yeah.
And then the student waited for an answer, and I was like, yeah, you're never going to get that answer. What you're going to get is put on a path, and is a path that, yeah, I hope you write that. Is this part of the essay collection as well, or is this a separate sort of curiosity?
That's just kind of something that always is rumbling in the back of my mind, that kind of question. And I mean, I think part of it comes from me being mixed race. And so as someone who's Japanese and white, the essentialism never works for me,
Mm-hmm.
unless it's in a really kind of humorous, ridiculous, absurdist
Yeah.
way. So it's always been kind of in the back of my mind.
Utterly crucial question. And, in the question of ethics, I'm so glad we can end on both of these. And I really, thank you for your time. I was really excited to have a chance to talk, and your thoughtfulness in this has just been really amazing. I'm just so happy that you're going to be a part of the series. This episode has so much for everyone to think about. So really sincerely, thank you for all of this.
Thank you. Thank you again. This was a really lovely conversation.
All right. Good to talk, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.